Hey everybody, it's David Weber teaching Essentials of Organization, and this is the lecture for week 4. It's actually the 5th week of the period by the calendar, because last week we had a break, but this is the 4th lecture, and the topic today is organizational culture. We're going to explore that, one of my favorite topics in the world of organizations, and one that has acquired a great deal of attention and interest in the last 30 years or so. So we'll talk about that. I'm going to do my best to look at the camera most of the time, but occasionally I'll be looking down at my slides, which are open right in front of me. And I suggest that that's what you do. Open the video here. I'm assuming you're looking at the video in YouTube, so open that. And then also open the PowerPoint slides for this lecture, Lecture 4, and then you can follow along back and forth between the two. And I'll let you know when a new slide is coming up and what the title or the topic of the slide is, so you can move through the slide deck. All right, so let's get started. First of all, I want you to think about the word culture. What does that mean to you? What does the word culture summon in your thinking? It's a word that's very, very commonly used nowadays. Used to mean very particularly what we might call, quote, high culture. Great music by Beethoven or Mozart. Great art that you find in the finest art museums in the world. That was for the longest time thought of as what culture was. But the definition, the concept of culture has expanded a great deal in the last 50 to 100 years, and definitely in the last 20 to 30 years. It's very difficult to go anywhere without hearing about culture. So what does that mean to you? What do you think? Well, there are, it so happens, many definitions of culture, many different ways of thinking about it, but we want to think about it in a way that's going to lead us to apply the concept to organizations. So in doing this, what we're going to do is start talking about culture somewhat broadly. Then we're going to start zeroing in on national culture, and then we're going to zero in on organizational culture, so that by the time we get there, we'll have a sense of what we're talking about when we talk about organizational culture. So the definition of culture that's in your slides, I think, is a perfectly adequate one. The values and attitudes shared by individuals who are members of a specific collectivity or group that shape their beliefs about what is important and directs their actions or behaviors following from those beliefs. Now, that's a mouthful. That's a lot of words. Let's break it down a little bit. First of all, culture is definable in terms of values and attitudes. I would also say behaviors, and I would definitely say communication choices. So these come together in a way that members of a collectivity, a group, ratify, meaning authorize, give a thumbs up to. Members of a group tend to ratify certain values, attitudes, beliefs, behaviors, actions, choices. And the idea is that a culture emerges whenever you have people forming a group. Last lecture we talked about 3 or more people are a group. And we've talked about an organization. We can talk about nations. We can talk about religious communities. We can talk about age-based collectivities. All of these groups or collectivities, all of these groups at one point or other in their lifespans, members start to find themselves agreeing about what's important, what's not important. What are we going to take seriously? What are we not going to take seriously? What beliefs do we want to share? What beliefs do we not particularly want to share? And one of the cleverest and I think most apt insights into culture that I ever remember hearing is that cultures do not emerge to make outsiders comfortable. And that's even given that some cultures put a great deal of importance on being hospitable to strangers and all that. But cultures evolve to enable people who are members of the collectivity to get along effectively with each other, to do their work more rather than less effectively, to make and build relationships more easily rather than less easily. All of these norms, values, beliefs, actions, behaviors, choices, it's a very complex mix that constitutes culture. And once those beliefs are in place, once certain types of actions are ratified, thumbs up, once that happens, it starts to help people who are members of that culture move through their days, move through their nights, move through the world. And if you're an outsider, you've got a lot to learn if you want to be an insider to a culture. So that's a basic sense of what culture is. And again, it's important to realize that anytime you have a group of people, no matter how small, 3 or more, 3 all the way up to 300 million, you have the basis of culture. Culture is a property of group behavior and interaction. Now, most commonly, perhaps, I don't know if I should say most commonly, but very, very commonly, when we think about culture, we think of what might be more specifically called national cultures. The cultures that arise among members of a collectivity called a nation. So we have U.S. American culture, we have Dutch culture, Vietnamese culture, French culture. All of these are nations: France, Vietnam, USA, the Netherlands. And they are collectivities of different sizes. The Dutch nation is, 11 million people, I think I read. United States, 320 million. China, 2.5, 3 billion people in that particular nation. Many of these nations are extremely diverse. We talked about diversity of ideology, diversity of perspective, diversity of skin color, diversity of age. We talked about that last time we talked about groups. Well, nations may be very diverse, some more than others, but anytime you have a collectivity as big as a nation, on one hand, you're not going to have 100% cohesion around a bunch of values, but you're going to have some cohesion by a great many people in that nation. The more people in a collectivity, the less likely it is that everybody's going to congeal around one idea, one value. But that doesn't mean that it's impossible to have a significant number of people who do. So national cultures, values are learned by people in those cultures, and then they're passed down to younger members of the culture or newer members of the culture. And the values vary by culture. And a Dutch scholar named Geert Hofstede, I think I pronounced his name okay. Those of you who are Dutch or from the Dutch Caribbean, maybe you can help me correct my pronunciation on that. But he's very well known. I heard about him many years ago when I was first studying this kind of thing. And what he did was he identified 6 areas of values that are found in national cultural groups. I said 6, I meant 5. I'm sorry, counting wrong. So I'm going to give you in the slides here a couple of YouTube videos that you can watch to get some details about the Hofstede's 5 dimensions of culture. I'm going to take a moment and kind of move them into thinking about organizations. So these 5 dimensions that Hofstede talked about are dimensions that you can use to analyze a national culture. That's how he originally thought about it. But very quickly after he published his results, organizational specialists started saying, gee, this could be used to talk about organizational culture as well, because an organization does have a culture. An organization is the collectivity. 10, 12, 112, 5,000, 100,000. These numbers are the numbers of people in some organizations, and every organization has a culture, and it differentiates every other organization from it. And that's the kind of thing we're talking about today. Now, what I want to do is talk about Hofstede's dimensions of national culture, but push it in the direction of using it to talk about culture and organizations. So one of the first dimension, and they are given in different order, different sequence by different people talking about them. I don't think there's any one best way to talk about them. But one dimension is called power distance. And this is the extent to which people in the collectivity accept that power, or not accept that power is distributed unequally. Now, in an organization, that holds true as well. I could be a member of an organization, and I could be very comfortable that power is distributed relatively unequally. That means there's a high power distance in that organization. Think about the military. Most people who are in the military, who make a career of being in the Navy or the Army or the Marine Corps, they are probably pretty comfortable with the fact that power and privilege and prestige and status is distributed unequally in the military. And many people will tell you that the military is a place where you have to earn your privilege, earn your status. And that's probably quite true. The power distance, we talk about it as a high power distance situation. Another organization might be very not so comfortable with that. So just for example, when I first started teaching at UNCW, the head of the department was a man named Frank. And Frank and I worked together because I was an instructor in the department. He was the chair. He was my boss. And we also were friends. But anyway, so there were about, in those days, there were 12 people teaching in the department. So one time I was talking with Frank about this and that and the other. And just, I was sort of kidding around, but not really, because he was my boss. I said, well, okay, boss, you got it, whatever. You know, he asked me if I could do something, and I said, okay, boss, no problem. And he said, well, I'm not your boss. He said, I really think of myself as a peer mentor, something like that. He was basically saying, I don't want power to be distributed unequally. When you call me boss, David, that's implying that you think that there is an unequal distribution of power. And I, Frank, as the chair, yes, I do have a certain kind of power in the organization, but I want that to be as limited in difference from the power that anybody else in the organization has. I want power to be distributed more rather than less equally. In other words, he was saying he wanted the power distance in our organization, our small organization, our 12 or 15 person department. He wanted the power distance to be low, limited. Individualism versus collectivism. This is probably the most famous of the dimensions because you hear those terms quite a bit. But an individualist culture is one in which people are encouraged to make their own decisions, to do things on their own. Collectivist culture is one in which it is more important to be contributing to the group than it is to be contributing to your own enrichment, pleasure, joy, what have you. Well, this is true in organizations. Some organizations are individualist type cultures. They have individualist type cultures. And an example of this might be a sales organization. Let's say that you have an organization that sells, pick a piece of merchandise, sells hats. And that organization is all about selling hats. And every time you sell a hat, you get a certain percentage commission. And when you're hired, you're told, look, the way you make money is you sell more hats than anybody else. You make more money than anybody else. If you want to sell hats 18 hours a day, go right ahead. We encourage you to do that because we want you to sell more hats. The more hats you sell, the better it is for us, but really the better it is for you. So I get a job in this organization, and I just sell hats all the time. I'm in the store selling hats. I take a bunch of hats home with me. I sell them on my own. When I go somewhere, when I go to a movie, I always take a couple of hats in my backpack just in case I start talking with someone while I'm waiting in line, and I slip in that they should buy a hat. That would be an individualist culture, organizational culture. That would be an individualist organizational culture. It's all about enriching yourself, using the opportunities that the collectivity gives you for yourself to thrive. A collectivist culture is we're all kind of in this together. And whatever you can do to enhance the group is what it's all about in that organization. Again, using the military is famous for being essentially a collectivist culture. If you see YouTube videos of military training, especially in certain military organizations, the U.S. Navy SEALs, the U.S. Marines, but it's also the French Foreign Legion, different military organizations. At one point or other, in almost all those videos, there's a scene in which the training officer, the training sergeant, is saying to a recruit something like, think about the team. Think about the team. That's the only thing you should be thinking about. Think about the group. Think about the group. Think about your small group that you're part of. It's not about you. It's not about I. And in fact, in the Marine Corps, in training, recruits are prohibited from using the word I. If I'm a recruit in the Marines and I want permission to go to the toilet, I don't say, may I please go to the toilet? I say, this recruit would like to go to the toilet. And the obvious task there that the training group is attempting to do, the trainers are trying to do, is they're trying to eradicate from your thinking, I, me, mine, my, and instead think about the group. And punishment sometimes in military training environments. If I make a mistake, everybody does exercises because I made a mistake. And the idea here is to, the slightest mistake you make, it has an impact on everybody else. So military organizations tend to be collectivist organizations. Third dimension is masculinity versus femininity. This is probably, number one, the most unfortunately named of the dimensions. And number two, probably as a result of that, it's misunderstood. But Hofstede realized that some cultures, and I'm translating it to organizations, some cultures are all about achievement, other cultures are all about nurturing. And I think, unfortunately, because it really gets people a little bit uncomfortable, backed up, he called the achievement dimension masculinity and the nurturing dimension femininity. I mean, I don't know why he just didn't stop at achievement versus nurturing. Who knows? But masculinity versus femininity really ultimately has nothing to do with men and women exactly, except in two ways a little bit. Number one, yes, it's true, we more often associate some of these outward achievement type activities with men and the nurturing activities with women. We make those connections all the time. That's very, very common. And also, there is sort of a, in the Hofstede view of things, all of these activities like power and control and so forth, those are associated with being masculine. I want us to focus more on achievement versus nurturing. And in an organization, what's more important for managers to do? To promote achievement or to promote personal growth, comfort, self-esteem? Which is more important for managers to cultivate? What are we wanting to do in customer service in our organization? Are we wanting to enable customers to get powerful and become better at getting control of their customers? Or are we wanting in customer service to enable our customers to feel like we are nurturing them and perhaps encouraging them to themselves be nurturing to their customers? So that dimension is also relevant to organizations. High versus low uncertainty avoidance, well, that just means that some organizations, as is true of national cultures. Some organizations have a culture in which tolerance for ambiguity, that's a term, tolerance for ambiguity is encouraged and it's high. People are comfortable not knowing what's going on. People are comfortable not knowing exactly what's going to happen next. Other organizations cultivate uncertainty avoidance. The one thing you want to do is not be uncertain about what's going to happen. The one thing you want to do is not be willing to be uncertain about whatever it may be. And a good example of this might be a chemical corporation. I'm thinking of Dow Chemical, which is famous for this, but any chemical corporation producing chemicals. Chemicals are potentially very dangerous. They're poisonous. They could be explosive. If you inhale vapors from some chemicals, that could be deadly, or at least get you very sick. So most chemical corporations, most chemical manufacturers, very low on uncertainty avoidance. They want everybody in the organization at all times to know this part of the plant, you must wear protective equipment. This part of the plant, less so important, but still, just to be on the safe side, you'd better wear protective equipment here. This part of the plant, you must make sure you're wearing a respirator before you go inside. No uncertainty about this. We are avoiding uncertainty by making sure that everybody does his or her bit to be safe and make sure others are safe. And that would be high uncertainty avoidance. Low uncertainty avoidance speaks for itself. Low uncertainty avoidance would mean an organization in which it's okay to not be sure about what happens next. Some organizations have to be very responsive to what kinds of things are happening. I might say, I'm thinking aloud, I think this could be a good example. Some firefighting organizations, maybe that would be an example of low uncertainty avoidance. You just are uncertain about a lot of things, and you just have to live with it and respond to what's going to be happening. If you're a firefighter, you go into a house, you don't know who's there, you don't know who's not there, you don't know what caused the fire, you don't know if the fire is going to hit something that's going to explode, you don't know if the floor is going to break if you're on the second floor. You have to be able to live with uncertainty and not avoid uncertainty, but rather live with it. That would be low uncertainty avoidance. And then finally, long-term versus short-term orientation. Some organizations build for success, not just now, but in the long term. Other organizations are oriented toward success, accomplishment in the short term. And one of the many things that organization specialists don't like about U.S. American organizations is many U.S. American organizations are oriented toward short-term achievement, getting a certain percentage increase by the next business quarter. Whereas in other nations, organizations it's perfectly normal and preferred for members of organizations to have an orientation to the long term. Yeah, we may not make money for many years, but suddenly down the road we're going to do it. Amazon.com started out that way, actually. Jeff Bezos, who founded Amazon, quarter after quarter after quarter, year after year, he didn't make any money. Amazon didn't make much money. But his orientation and the orientation of the people that he gathered around him was for the long term. We're going to do what we can to survive, to make it, and then one day it's going to pop for us, and it's not going to stop popping into the long term. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. So those are Hofstede's dimensions of culture, and you can watch those videos to find out more about them kind of in the pure way they were articulated. But I've kind of translated them to the organizational context. And the next slide, I'm not going to walk too far through it, but it gives you a chart of national cultures at the extremes of each of those dimensions. And I sort of alluded to that. I sort of referred to that kind of thinking when I gave you examples of, an organization that's on this side and an organization that's on that side of a given dimension. And again, every organization constructs its own cultures. Its own culture. These cultures distinguish one organization from another. No two organizations are exactly alike, culturally speaking, even if they're in the same business. So we're talking about Aviko potato. Yeah, that's very much like Ora-Ida potatoes, and it's very much unlike them. You can probably see some similarities, but a person who gets a job in Ora-Ida, then leaves that job and gets a job in Aviko, he's going to have to do a lot of learning in a short amount of time if he wants to become a successful insider in Aviko. Just because he was in Ora-Ida doesn't mean he's going to make it in Aviko, or she. Now, organizational culture is a function of a couple of things that need to be mentioned here. It's perception, number one. I, as a member of the organization, perceive the culture to be a certain way. And what happens is that I sort of test this out. I, for example, perceive people in the organization, especially when I'm new, I perceive people in the organization to dress very formally. And so when I show up on my first day at work and I'm not wearing a coat and tie, I notice that, and my perception tells me that I probably need to make some change. I may check it out. I may actually ask someone, say, I never actually got formally advised, but is it just my imagination, or do we dress kind of formally around here? And the person may say, yeah, we dress kind of formally around here. That person has just described the culture. So one feature of culture is how what you perceive, the values, the behaviors, the beliefs, etc. What you perceive them to be, you may or may not check them out. And in any case, if you check them out and someone explains it to you, describes it to you, or doesn't, that person is able perhaps to describe it, on some other occasion. So description of the values, description of the norms, that's part of what culture involves. And then the idea of sharing, that members of the culture share all these things. We're in this together. We are all going through this experience of learning the culture and maintaining the culture. We're doing this together. And what's interesting is that culture doesn't stay the same. Culture is not constant. Culture evolves over time. And I can't think of a better example than what we're doing right now. Here we are. I'm giving a video lecture. Normally, this would have been me in a small room, B106 or D104, giving a lecture to you. I'd have my smart board going, perhaps. And suddenly, all of us are teaching online. All of us are studying online. This is creating some new cultural features. Suddenly, it is a big deal whether or not an instructor knows a little bit about how to deal effectively with Teams, Microsoft Teams or Zoom. And just earlier today, I was saying to my students, so I finally got in a meeting room with them, a virtual meeting room. I said, geez, I still don't know how to invite people to join Teams. If I'm in the Teams space, how do I invite people to join? Well, that may be okay right now for me to not be quite sure about it. But if I were to be here in the fall and we were to still be teaching online in the fall, and by the fall I didn't know how to get into Teams and how to really manage that Teams environment, the organizational culture of the Han, the values and the beliefs and the behaviors that were green lighted, thumbs up, I might have some pushback from students and colleagues. Because the culture has shifted in such a way that 2 months ago, if I had walked into the B106 where all of the other instructors were, I said, hey, by the way, I don't know how to use this MS Teams. Probably 5, 6, 7, 8 people say, yeah, me neither, but who cares? Now it's a different ballgame completely. So the culture is not staying constant. It's evolving over time. Going back to a military example, I was talking with a guy who was a trainer of Marines, and this is a few years ago. And I was saying, well, what do you find? Because he was an older guy, and I said, okay, so you've been in the Marine Corps 20 years. You've been doing, you've been a Marine Corps trainer for 10 years. I said, what do you find different about young Marines today versus young Marines of 10 or 15 years ago? He said, I can answer that very easily. I think about it all the time. He said, the big difference is today, the young Marines ask why all the time. And he said, it drives me crazy. He said, because, 15, 20 years ago, no one asked why. You just did what the gunnery sergeant told you to do. You did what the drill instructor told you to do. You didn't ask why. Nowadays, they'll ask why. Well, the culture of the Marine Corps is shifting just slightly to accommodate that change. So drill instructors are trained now how to respond to a why question in a way that on one hand supports the lessons that they're supposed to be teaching, which is teach people how to obey orders. You don't ask why, you just obey orders. Teach that lesson, but in a way that will enable you to not appreciate, but will enable you to make it okay that the person asks why, maybe on a particular occasion. Now, that's not going to happen a lot. But if I say, shut up and do it, because I'm telling you to, that's one thing. But if I say, do what I'm telling you to do because it's going to help you if you ever face combat. Now I've given you a why, and I've been stern and strict and no nonsense, but I've implied there's a why in here. There's an answer to your why. So the culture changes just a little bit. And then the next slide called Dimensions of Organizational Culture. I'm not going to go through that in great detail. You can read that on your own. But this kind of summarizes some key dimensions of organizational culture that are sort of alongside the Hofstede dimensions. You can kind of pair the Hofstede dimensions and this list of dimensions of organizational culture. And you can sort of use both of those sets of dimensions to really examine the culture of any organization. Just a couple of these are sort of interesting. Look at this one. Outcome orientation, people orientation, team orientation. So, a given culture, to one culture, one organization, its culture favors outcome orientation. All we really, really care about is hitting those sales targets. People orientation, another organization, could be all about what we really are all about is enabling our people to grow, to feel more confident, to do better work. Or team orientation. What this organization is really all about is we want to get people working really well in small groups because so much of what we do is in small groups. Manufacturing organizations is kind of interesting. Manufacturing organizations, before robots took over so much in manufacturing all over the world, in the 80s and 90s, there was a move toward team organization in manufacturing. So in decade after decade, for many years in automobile manufacturing, for example. And I think the Volvo factory in Sweden pioneered this. And if they didn't, a factory in, could have been Toyota, I can't remember, in Japan may have pioneered it. They may have given the idea to the Swedish manufacturing. It doesn't matter, really. But, for decades, the way you built cars was you had an assembly line. And at the beginning of the assembly line, you had people, putting, the base of the car on the assembly line and, screwing things in. And then it would roll along on the assembly line. And then the next few people would put on tires. And the next people would put on doors and so forth. And that's what you did. You put on your door, you put on the door, you put on the door. Or you turn the screw at the beginning. You turn the screw, you did whatever. And that was how cars got made. And at the end of the assembly line, after, an hour or 2 hours, whatever, boom, a car would be ready. It would be driven off to a warehousing location and eventually shipped to a dealer to be sold, etc. Well, at a certain point in the 70s and 80s, Some of these car manufacturers moved from an outcome orientation, which was just get those cars off the line. Do what you got to do. Doesn't matter. We're not people oriented necessarily, because if you get hurt, all right, you go. You're fired. We'll hire someone else to turn the screw instead of you. Outcome orientation. We just got to get those cars out there. Well, a shift took place toward team orientation, meaning suddenly what happened, not suddenly, but what happened was instead of having an assembly line with all these cars, you'd have one team of 6 or 7 people who worked to build one car or build most of one car and then put it on the line, and it went down to another team that put the finishing touches on it. But car manufacturers were very much were discovering quite often that this improved morale in the organization, commitment to the team, to have everybody do its best to build more cars than other teams. There was this healthy competition that took place, and the cars were higher quality, was the big discovery. Now, much of this has changed because of robotics and so forth. But that's just an example of an organization, a car manufacturer, that would have been outcome-oriented, and then it became team-oriented. What can we do to make the teams work more effectively? So look through this list of dimensions of organizational culture, pair it with the Hofstede list, and you will get some good insights into how to analyze the culture of an organization. Strong organizational cultures. A lot of organizations do have strong cultures. I think the most important piece there, 2 really important pieces, 2 very important pieces. The values are widely known and shared, and people really commit to them. If it's a strong culture, people really commit. Also, another one that's interesting is most employees know the history and the heroes of the organization. Again, I apologize for using the Marines so often, but it's an organization I know and love. And they're an excellent organization for a lot of reasons. And one reason is, you may have this young man or woman who's a U.S. Marine, and he or she may not know much about world history. He or she may not know much about U.S. history. But that person darn well knows lots about Marine Corps history. And he or she can tell you the names and the dates of great battles and great achievements by the Marines. And heroes. In strong organizational cultures, people from the past who embody the values, they are known in the kind of the collective memory. They may have been long gone, but they're still remembered. And a hero in this case is someone who absolutely embodies the best of what it means to be a member of that organization. In my organization back in North Carolina, we occasionally have students come through who we still talk about, and we'll say of someone who is currently a really, really good student. I may be talking about this person with my friend Bill, and Jane is really good. This is why she's so good. And then Bill might say, yeah, she sounds great. He says, but is she another Tyler Cobb? Because Tyler Cobb was the name of this guy who graduated 10 years ago. And we're still talking about him as being exactly the kind of student you'd love to have. You wish you had 10 of these students, because it would make everybody else sort of want to live up to that, all the other students. Tyler Cobb, wonderful guy. He got a great job after he graduated. He still occasionally emails us. To say hello. He's a hero. He is the epitome of what we think is most important to become by studying in our department. So organizational cultures are very clear on their history and their heroes. And the next slide, a socialization model. This just kind of summarizes what has to happen to get you into fitting in organizational culture. They call it the pre-arrival stage, the encounter stage, and metamorphosis. Pre-arrival, everything that happens before your first days or weeks in the organization. Pre-arrival means everything you've heard about, everything you've thought about, everything people have told you, and then you have the encounter stage begin, and that can last a few days or a few weeks. That's your first kind of breaking into the organization, and you make some mistakes, you violate some cultural norms you didn't know existed until you break them and someone tells you. That's all this sort of navigating the pitfalls of being a newbie. And then finally, there's the metamorphosis stage. And the metamorphosis stage is when you find, you feel, you believe, I'm now a full status member of the organization. My productivity goes up, my commitment increases, turnover goes down. The more people who get to the metamorphosis stage of involvement in an organization, the less likely is they're going to leave in a short time frame. They may stay for several years instead of just several months. So socializing someone into the organization is really another way of saying enabling someone to learn the culture. Mentoring, teaching, coaching, advising, enabling someone to move through the encounter process to reach metamorphosis and change into a fully committed, fully socialized, fully culturally aware member. And there are many ways by which employees learn culture. I want you to pay attention to these because you're going to be trying to find examples from Avico Potato. So there's really four to kind of think about. Stories. And stories are exactly what that means. I tell you about something that happened in the past to illustrate an important quality. This happens in all organizations. So using the Tyler Cobb example, if I have a student, for example, and it happens all the time, if I have a student who doesn't put a great deal of time and attention to detail in his work, and I have a conversation with that kid, and I say, look, you're very smart, you've got a lot of potential here, all you need to do is start spending a little bit more time on X, Y, Z. And the student says, well, yeah, I hear you, but, I've got a lot of work I'm trying to do, and, I've got a job, and I just got married, and all this. And I'll say, well, let me tell you about this guy named Tyler Cobb, who graduated here about 10 years ago. Tyler was this guy, and he started out, he was like a real mess when he was a first-year student. Grades were low, motivation was low. And then a couple of years later, man, he was like the best student we had. He was so smart and on time with everything, participated in class and participated in extracurricular activities. We gave him an award for being the exemplar of what it is that we think of when we think of a great student. And at one point, I remember asking Tyler, I said, how'd you make that switch? And he said, it was simple. He said, I realized it was either be who I really was or live a very unsatisfied life. It was very philosophical. So I tell that story to the student. They say, you can live the way you're living and you're going to spend years being unsatisfied, or you can live as your best self and you're going to be a lot happier, a lot more satisfied. You're going to be more pleasant to be around. I'm going to enjoy teaching you more. All of this is up to you. But think about that story I just told you about Tyler. Well, that's anchoring the past in the present. That's trying to get someone who's a member of the organization motivated to live a different way, to make some different choices. Rituals. A little bit difficult to talk about. Rituals, basically think of those as repetitive sets of activities that are used to mark certain moments in a person's life as a member of the organization. And these rituals reinforce key values of the organization. So a ritual might be that, back to the socialization, let's say that when you move through the encounter stage and you make it through the metamorphosis stage, there could be a ritual, which is you and the three other people that entered the organization when you did and moved through pre-arrival and encounter the same period of time you did. And now it's your 6 months probation are up. You have passed all of the different criteria for knowing what you're doing and being someone who's aware of what the organization values. And so there's a dinner. And at the dinner, the three of you stand up. Each of you has to sing a song, and at the end of the song, everybody boos you. And then, however, everybody stands up, walks past you, shakes your hand, and the last person to shake your hand gives you a little pin that you put on your jacket. That would be an example of a ritual, a repetitive sequence of events. They do it every year for the new people who make it through to metamorphosis, and that signifies certain values, whatever those values may be. Material symbols. This means everything from the building you're in, the office space you inhabit, symbols like logos of the organization, symbols like a coffee cup. Coffee cup could be a material symbol. If you walk around holding a coffee cup, that means maybe you're in management. Material symbols have some value in making some meaning about the organization. I talked about the pin. I was making up that example, but it's not far from the truth. But I talked about the pin that signifies you're a full status, metamorphosized member of the organization. That's a material symbol of achievement. Language specifically means unique or distinctive language, terminology in the organization. It does not specifically or necessarily mean the natural language that most people speak. This is a big, something that many students in this module sometimes don't get straight. So just for example, last semester when we worked with Rotra, people were writing about analyzing the culture of Rotra, and they said Dutch is the most common language spoken and followed by English. That's not what language means when we talk about culture. Yes, it sort of is what we mean in the sense that if the culture of the organization, well, Han's a good example, the culture of Han encourages more rather than less use of English, to the point where sometimes in some conversations with some of my colleagues, they would apologize to me for speaking in Dutch. And I would say it's perfectly okay. But English is the lingua franca, the common natural language chosen by leaders of Han to be what we all communicate with. But that's not specifically what this language piece is about. This language piece in culture is more about the unique or distinctive vocabulary, terminology that characterizes an organization. And for that, we can also look to the Han. Certain ways of saying stuff. We talk about scrums in the GA cluster. We did not invent that word. We borrowed that word from Six Sigma, but excuse me, that's a word we use. We don't use that word scrum in my university in North Carolina. In this university in Han, there's a term desk research, which I really like a lot. I had never heard that term before coming here, and it's great. I'm going to bring it back to my organization in North Carolina and see if I can socialize them into using, my colleagues there, socialize them into using a term. It's a wonderful term. I never had a good term for sitting at a desk, looking at databases on your computer, or looking in a book or a journal article. We'd call that documentary research or archival research, but that's not quite it. It's desk research. And applying that to an organization, I think it's a great term. It's something that's distinctive of the vocabulary of Han. What's also interesting, what a lot of people wonder, is how does this culture get started? Well, generally, culture in an organization, first of all, it starts as soon as you have 3 or more people who are starting to make a collectivity. And you really could talk about 2 people. By the way, we often talk them that often, but people who study relationships, and that means friendships, love relationships, romantic relationships, parent-child relationships, boss-subordinate relationships, sexual relationships, any kind of relationship, any kind of interconnection between two people. That's what we mean when we say relationship. Well, there are some people who study relationships, and they study something called relational culture, meaning two people construct a relationship, and very soon they are doing things a certain way. My grandmother once told me that she called my grandfather, when they first met, she called him Mr. Martz for weeks and weeks and weeks. The relational culture that they constructed was quite formal. It took a long time before they started to call each other Joe and Loretta, apparently. And part of that was the era. This is back in many, 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 many decades ago. My grandparents are both long gone. But still, the point is, the relational culture was such that you didn't depart from calling each other Miss Pritchard and Mr. Martz. But anyway, I don't want to get too off on relational culture. But anyway, the question is, how does organizational culture get started? And the answer is, generally, it's the founder. The founder's view of the world, the founder's perceptions of what's good and bad, right and wrong, fair and unfair, needed and not needed. He or she, or they, if it's a small team. I mean, Google was founded by three guys who were college students together at Stanford University. But the person or the small group of people, a team that founded an organization, that started, that established the organization, founding the organization, they get the ball rolling. They kind of initiate, they start the culture based on how they look at the world. They make certain choices. Based on what they believe is important, they make certain choices. Based on what they fear or don't fear, like or don't like about organizations, that makes them make some choices. If I, very old American high-tech company called HP, Hewlett Packard. The two guys who started Hewlett Packard, Mr. Hewlett and Mr. Packard, both of them used to work in another, it wouldn't have been called a high-tech organization in those days, but for the era it was, an advanced, technologically advanced organization. They didn't like the high level of formality. You had to wear a white shirt and a certain color tie and a certain color suit. They didn't like that. So when they started HP, they emphatically said, no ties, no suits, no coats. And the HP culture is informal in attire, has always been. And so think about some of the famous founders of organizations, Bill Gates, Fred Smith of FedEx, Walt Disney of Disney Corporation. The way that they were as people, as human beings, put a huge stamp on that organization. Fred Smith was a Marine, as a matter of fact. He was a Marine aviator. And that discipline, that commitment to punctuality, that insistence on taking care to make every detail done right, that's what he learned when he was a Marine. And he took that into the world of logistics and delivery. And FedEx is that way. A little bit different from UPS or DHL. You can recognize when you're in one or the other of those companies. Walt Disney of Disney Corporation. He was a really interesting combination of really, really relaxed and really, really intense. And I spent some time doing some consulting work with the Disney Corporation. And sure enough, they are a combination of really relaxed and really intense. What they're relaxed about is kind of the way they encounter you, the way they talk with you. But they're really, really intense about loving Disney. I mean, they intensely love the Disney Corporation. I never met anybody from Disney who was lukewarm about it. And they're very, very intense about doing things the Disney way. So it's quite interesting. And that was Walt Disney. The guy who started it all was that way. So no surprise that it is still that way. The next few slides are just some practice opportunities for you. Here's a slide about Apple computers with a picture of Steve Jobs. Now, lots of people know a number of things about Steve Jobs. What I want you to kind of think about is, what do we know about Steve Jobs that also is what we know about Apple computers? And one of the big questions a few years ago when Steve Jobs passed away was, how is Apple going to change? And there were many spokespeople from the Apple Corporation saying it's not going to change. Yes, Jobs was innovative, he was creative, he was oriented to excellence. Anything that was less than excellence, he wouldn't ship. And he was very tuned into being a visionary and really contributing to the world. He had his personal flaws. Lots of people, didn't like him at a personal level, but he was all of those things from a professional point of view. And Apple definitely embodied many of those qualities. So the question was, now that he's gone, what's Apple going to be like? And many spokespeople from Apple said it's not going to change. That's baked into who we are. But sure enough, as the past few years have gone by, you can read articles saying, what happened to Apple? Why is, Jobs, when he died, that really made a difference. And then other people say, no, not really. So the jury is still out here. But the point is, think about Stephen Jobs, what you know about him. If you don't know anything about him, look him up on Wikipedia. And think about how Apple does or doesn't, in your experience of Apple, reflect Stephen Jobs. The next slides are just some video content to practice this stuff with. There's some videos about Google, and there's some videos about Apple. And then there's a nice little sort of biography of Nike, the organization, about a 9-minute video. So what I want you to do is look at those videos, watch those videos, and see what you can do about applying all of the things we've been talking about with respect to culture to the material in those videos. This has been a long lecture. I appreciate your patience, and I look forward to seeing you in Zoom or Meet Up, Teams, or just in email. Take care of yourselves.